I want you to think back to your school days for a second.
Wow, wow. Okay, yeah, going right in.
Yeah, right into the trauma. But seriously, picture yourself sitting at that tiny desk, staring at like a test or a reading assignment.
Mm-hmm.
You get it back, and there's this big, glaring red grade at the top. But looking back at it now, were you actually being graded on how well you understood the material?
Right.
Or, were you just being graded on how well you played the game of school?
It is a fundamentally uncomfortable question, honestly, because we invest so much belief into the idea that our educational systems are these like perfect meritocracies of knowledge.
Totally.
Like if a student gets an A, the assumption is just, boom, they have mastered the concept. And if they get a C, well, they just need to study harder.
Exactly. We want the grade to be this pure, objective reflection of intellect. But the source material we're pulling apart for this deep dive reveals something entirely different.
It really does.
Today, we're looking at this really fascinating set of analytical transcripts, and they examine how teachers actually assess literacy in the classroom. So the mission for today's deep dive is to unpack this massive but kind of subtle divide.
Yeah, it's a huge divide.
It's the difference between literacy as an epistemic process, meaning the actual messy business of building and exploring knowledge, versus literacy as an institutional performance, basically, just fitting in.
What's fascinating here is that the implications stretch miles beyond a primary school classroom. I mean, this research touches the very foundation of how our society defines what it actually means to be competent.
Right.
The core finding we're exploring today is that schools consistently prioritize measurable institutional performance over actual meaning-making.
Wow.
And this dynamic, it shapes how we learn to read, sure, but it also hardwires how we learn to exist in adult professional spaces later on.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how the system gets it wrong, I feel like we first need to establish what literacy should actually look like, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Because the traditional view is that reading is just scanning words on a page, absorbing the facts, and then moving on.
Exactly, like a scanner. But the analytical transcripts ground their alternative in something called the reading for emotion model, or RFE.
Reading for emotion.
Right. And in this framework, literacy is defined as the capacity to act effectively within a discourse. It's not about just reproducing established forms or, sounding out syllables phonetically.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's your ability to mobilize concepts, to position yourself with authority, and to actually shape meaning. Texts aren't just these neutral vehicles carrying facts from point A to point B.
They're more like these organized configurations of tension, right?
Right.
Tension, expectation, contrast, resolution.
Exactly. And Mikhail Bakhtin's theory of language being dialogic is heavily referenced in the sources here.
Dialogic, so meaning like a dialogue.
Yeah. Bakhtin argued that meaning is never just transmitted cleanly from a book directly into a brain. It is constantly negotiated. It's contested. Think of a child reading a story where a character makes a highly questionable choice. If the child stops and thinks, wait, that's incredibly unfair, why didn't the character just leave? That is dialogic. The text isn't a dead object, it's a conversation partner. The reader is actively pushing back, sort of re-accenting the text with their own lived experience.
So reading isn't like downloading a PDF to your brain. It's more like a negotiation or a dance. The reader brings their own baggage, their own perspective, and literally collides with the text.
That's a great way to put it.
And the source material also brings in neuroaesthetic principles to explain this collision, which, I gotta be honest, sounds incredibly intense for a discussion about kids reading.
I know, it's got a big word.
But it essentially boils down to how the brain processes tension, right?
It does, yeah. Neuroaesthetics looks at how the brain uses emotional and aesthetic structuring to actually heighten attention. A good way to visualize this is to think of a rubber band.
Okay, a rubber band.
Right. When an author constructs a complex sentence or sets up a plot point, they are basically stretching a syntactic or narrative rubber band.
Oh, I like that.
And the reader holds their breath, feeling that tension build. When the verb finally hits, or the plot resolves, the rubber band snaps back. There's a literal affective release in the brain. That emotional engagement is what actually invites a learner into a process of genuine discovery.
The rubber band metaphor makes perfect sense. You're feeling the stretch, you're anticipating the snap, and you're making meaning out of that kinetic energy.
Exactly.
But let me step into the shoes of a teacher for a second. Let's play devil's advocate.
Sure.
If true literacy is this beautiful, messy, highly internalized cognitive stretch and release, how on earth do I put a rubric on that?
Yeah, that's the problem.
I mean, I have 30 kids in a room. I can't grade a neuroaesthetic rubber band. I need metrics, you know?
And that institutional reality is the catalyst for everything that follows in the data. Grading a dynamic, unfolding, internalized process is practically impossible at scale.
Right.
So, to make assessment manageable, the educational system transforms literacy into something that is institutionally legible. The system requires stability. It requires recognizable, enforceable forms.
So the moment we demand that learning be stable, observable, and perfectly aligned with a standardized formula, we basically strip the student of their role as an active participant.
Yes.
We trade the epistemic process for the institutional performance.
You nailed it. And the data in our transcripts illustrates exactly how this trade happens in practice. The researchers analyzed the assessment styles of several different teachers to see how they manage this tension.
Okay, let's look at the ways teachers enforce this institutional legibility. The transcripts give us our first teacher, Karen.
Yes, Karen.
She's a primary school teacher, and her entire approach centers around what the researchers label school-like talk.
Right. And Karen ties a student's credibility entirely to their interactional style.
What does that mean, exactly?
Well, she wants clear sentences, complete responses, and formulations that are explicitly teacher-facing. So if a student in Karen's class projects energy and speaks with clear, conventional formatting, Karen interprets that performance as competence.
So they're playing the part.
Exactly. The student is successfully playing the role of the good student for the audience, which is the teacher. But if a student's contribution is, tentative, playful, exploratory, maybe indirect, Karen intercepts it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she will immediately redirect them or just reformulate their answer into the sanctioned format.
It seems like if a kid is in the middle of that dialogic negotiation we just talked about,
Right.
maybe they're pausing, feeling out the tension of the text, thinking out loud, and testing a weird idea, Karen doesn't see a cognitive process.
Yeah, she doesn't.
She just sees a behavioral misstep.
Exactly. The criteria for judgment in her classroom have been entirely externalized. Meanings are only granted legitimacy when they align with expected interpretations and are spoken aloud in a recognized format.
That's so limiting.
The transcripts define this as selective recognition of agency.
Selective recognition of agency. Right. The student is allowed to have agency, but it's highly conditional. It only counts if it mirrors what the institution expects.
Wow. And while Karen acts like a casting director demanding the right performance, the next teacher in the study, Adele, she's running basically a cognitive assembly line.
Oh, Adele is fascinating.
Yeah, Adele's evaluative framework is almost exclusively focused on temporal and procedural efficiency, speed, automaticity, independence.
Yeah.
There's this line from Adele in the transcripts describing her ideal students that is genuinely startling.
I know the exact one you're talking about.
She says, they know it, they write it, they don't sit there and think about it.
They don't sit there and think about it. Adele explicitly frames the act of thinking as a defect.
That is wild to me.
In her classroom, competence is inferred solely from how fast and effortlessly a student can produce a rehearsed form, handwriting, spelling, sight words.
If a student sits there and works through an idea slowly, they're actually positioned as less competent. Her primary stated goal is getting them ready for the procedural transition to the next grade.
But wait, let me offer some genuine pushback here, just to be fair to Adele.
Go for it.
Because before a student can have a high-level dialogic debate about the philosophical themes of a novel, don't they need to know how to read the words on the page?
Of course.
Like, cognitive load theory tells us that if a kid is struggling to sound out syllables, they have no brain power left over to analyze the plot. So, doesn't drilling sight words and demanding automaticity actually free up cognitive load for that higher-level thinking later?
That's a fair point.
Right. Like, why is it inherently bad to teach the scales before you ask them to play jazz?
Okay, the danger highlighted by the research isn't the teaching of the scales. The danger is convincing the student that the scale is the music.
Oh, wow.
Right, and then penalizing them if they pause to try a new chord. Building automaticity is absolutely pedagogically valid, but Adele elevates procedural speed from a foundational tool to the ultimate metric of intelligence.
Ah, I see the difference.
Comprehension takes a complete backseat to fluent performance. Thinking, hesitation, alternative modes of engagement, they are actively discouraged because they slow down the assembly line.
I see the distinction. It's not that spelling doesn't matter. It's that Adele has equated the rapid execution of a skill with actual learning.
Yes.
The system is regulating how learning must appear in order to be validated. But this naturally leads to a massive contradiction.
It really does.
Because if we assume that Karen and Adele are just enforcing these rules because they're dealing with young kids who need basic compliance.
Which is usually the excuse, yeah.
What happens when a student's cognitive load is completely freed up? Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when a student is undeniably brilliant, but flat out refuses to perform the institutional routine?
And that scenario brings us to the third teacher in the study, Neil.
Neil
And his student, Kim. This dynamic is arguably the most analytically powerful case in the entire set of transcripts because it isolates the variable of competence.
Yeah, the data on Kim is unequivocal. He is scoring completely off the charts in standardized testing. He's at NAPLAN Band 7, which, for anyone outside Australia, is exceptionally high for his age.
Extremely high.
And Neil himself explicitly calls Kim brilliant on the record. He fully acknowledges Kim's high-level conceptual ability, yet Neil refuses to look at Kim's written work.
Yep.
He actively labels the student as lazy. And why? Because Kim refuses to use capital letters or full stops.
Exactly. For Neil, meaning is not sufficient in itself.
Right.
The correctness of the form is an absolute prerequisite for the work to even be acknowledged, let alone graded.
It is the equivalent of firing your lead software engineer who just wrote a groundbreaking paradigm-shifting algorithm simply because they didn't format their email to HR with the proper corporate sign-off.
Yes, exactly.
You have pure, measurable competence sitting right in front of you, and you are rejecting it over formatting.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Neil's classroom proves a vital point about our educational structures. Even when epistemic competence is explicit, undeniable, and perfectly measurable by outside standards.
Like the NAPLAN test.
Exactly. Institutional norms completely override conceptual recognition. Legitimization is actively withheld because the knowledge isn't dressed in the right institutional clothing.
It's crazy. Neil decides whether Kim is ready for high school, not by looking at his actual intellectual capacity, but by measuring his compliance, task completion, adherence to writing conventions.
Right.
A student who vastly exceeds the expected levels of understanding is deemed not ready just because he won't play a formatting game.
Now, the researchers are careful to note that this isn't simply a case of Neil being a malicious or, incompetent teacher.
Okay, that's important.
It is a structural failure. Neil, like a lot of educators, does not have a stable, institutionally backed conceptual framework to integrate Kim's higher order, lateral thinking into his daily assessment.
He literally doesn't have the tools.
Exactly. The standardized rubrics prioritize enforceable conventions. So, under the immense pressure of managing a classroom, Neil just falls back on the safe, routinized criteria. Capital letters and full stops are visible. They're easily enforceable.
The system essentially forces Neil to criminalize Kim's brilliance.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to frame it.
Assessment in this context operates less as a reflection of actual learning and almost entirely as a system of normative alignment. It's about enforcing conformity to a rubric.
Pure and simple.
But surely, if primary school is bogged down by formatting, speed, and handwriting, you'd assume high school assessment actually targets deep meaning, right? Like, once the kids know how to use full stops, we can finally grade the neuroaesthetic rubber band.
You would certainly hope so. But the data from the final teacher, a Year 7 educator named Diane, reveals a much more sophisticated trap.
Yeah, reading Diane's transcript initially feels like a breath of fresh air.
He does.
She isn't talking about speed or punctuation. She is throwing around heavy academic terms like composers, deliberate choices, context, alternative readings. She sounds like a university literature professor.
She really does. It marks a clear, qualitative shift away from the procedural criteria that Adele and Neil relied upon. Diane introduces disciplinary abstraction. She explicitly wants her students to account for authorial intention and contextual influences.
So, Diane is essentially doing the same thing as Neil, but instead of demanding punctuation, she's demanding a specific brand of literary criticism.
Bingo.
It's an illusion of intellectual freedom. She has just shifted the criteria from procedural compliance to conceptual compliance.
The illusion operates by shifting the criteria, yes. Diane frames literacy as the acquisition of sanctioned interpretive frameworks.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means she is not asking students to generate their own interpretations from a genuine dialogic encounter with a text. She's not asking them to make their own messy thinking visible.
Right.
Instead, she is actively positioning them to move toward predefined analytical constructs.
Wow. So we are just trading behavioral compliance for intellectual compliance.
You do that, though.
Instead of performing good handwriting, the Year 7 students are performing sounding like a literary critic. They are learning to parrot back the correct contextual analysis that the teacher wants to hear so they can be prepared for the senior years.
Yes.
They don't actually have to feel the tension of the text. They just have to use the word juxtaposition correctly in a sentence.
And that is exactly the structural limitation that researchers point out. Diane foregrounds these advanced concepts, but she completely omits the processes by which learners actually construct or personalize those concepts.
She gives them the destination, but ignores the journey.
Exactly. She acknowledges that multiple interpretations of a text exist, but those interpretations are implicitly bounded by the framework she provides.
It is a disciplinary disguise. It looks like deep epistemic learning on the surface. It uses all the right vocabulary. But structurally, the mechanism is identical to what Karen, Adele, and Neil are doing.
Across all 4 case studies, a student's agency is only recognized when they align with expected forms of expression.
It's so consistent.
Very. Karen demands the reproduction of interactional forms. Adele demands the reproduction of automatic, speedy performance. Neil demands the reproduction of correct, independent output. And Diane demands the reproduction of disciplinary interpretations.
When you map it out like that, the mechanism is chillingly consistent. It is the exact same engine of conformity, just wearing different masks depending on the grade level of the students.
Yeah, exactly.
What gets lost at every single stage is the student's ability to demonstrate how meaning is actually constructed. Their personal, effective, and experiential responses, that snap of the rubber band we talked about, are completely sidelined unless they can instantly rearticulate them into the institutionally sanctioned format.
This brings us to the ultimate synthesis of the data. Our educational foundation, as modeled by these transcripts, systematically rewards institutional legibility over epistemic exploration. We train students to seek the predefined mold, to prioritize stability and predictability, and basically to make sure the evaluator has something easy to measure.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Because these patterns absolutely do not vanish the moment you walk across a graduation stage and get a diploma.
Oh no, they follow you.
They hardwire how we interact with information, how we solve problems, and how we behave in the adult professional world.
This raises an urgent question for how you consume and process information today. When you read a market report, or analyze a new piece of software, or review a policy document, are you reading to truly engage?
Right.
Are you allowing yourself to feel the tension of the ideas, to challenge the underlying assumptions, and to engage in a dialogic negotiation with the material?
Or, are you just skimming the document to extract the correct talking points so you can perform competence in your next Zoom meeting? Because that is exactly what Diane was training her Year 7 students to do. Find the sanctioned interpretation, say it out loud using the right vocabulary, and get the nod of approval from the authority figure in the room.
We carry these institutional habits directly into the workplace. We learn very early on that visibility and compliance are rewarded far more consistently than deep, messy, divergent thinking.
Honestly, think about the corporate versions of the teachers we just discussed. We all know a corporate Karen, the manager, who cares significantly more about your professional tone and formatting in a meeting than the actual quality of your ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
If you pitch a brilliant strategy but you sound slightly tentative or indirect, your idea gets completely sidelined.
And then there's the corporate Adele, the supervisor who just worships at the altar of inbox zero.
Oh man, it's the worst.
They value fast turnaround times and immediate replies over deep strategic thinking. If you take a day to slowly work through a complex problem, you're viewed as less competent than the employee who fires off a mediocre solution in 5 minutes.
Then you have the corporate Neil, the executive who will literally reject a groundbreaking financial model or a brilliant creative pitch because the slide deck isn't using the standard company font or the margins are off.
Yes.
They cannot process your competence because it isn't institutionally legible to them.
And finally, the corporate Diane, the leadership team that constantly asks for innovative, out-of-the-box thinking, but will only validate your ideas if you use the current corporate buzzwords, synergy, agile, pivot, and miraculously arrive at the exact strategic conclusion they had already decided on beforehand.
It is the exact same game, just with higher stakes and a salary attached.
It really is.
It leaves you with a pretty profound final thought to mull over. If our entire educational foundation is built on rewarding institutional performance rather than authentic meaning-making, how much of our adult professional identity is just us continuing to play school?
That is the question, isn't it?
Next time you are writing an email, summarizing a report, or sitting in a strategy meeting, I want you to ask yourself a hard question. Are you actually communicating something meaningful? Are you engaging in a genuine epistemic process? Or are you just making sure you use your capital letters and your corporate buzzwords so society knows you fit in?
It's definitely something to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've loved unpacking this with you. Keep questioning the frameworks around you, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.